ability of your business to sell enough of its product or service to make a satisfactory profit and be attractive to potential backers. Okay. That's a reasonable, design or specification of business. Another specification is a business plan is a selling document that conveys the excitement and promise of your business to any potential backers or stakeholders. So business plan is just, this is like something to get excited about, what we're trying to sell and what we're trying to do. And we're trying to excite your backers or your stakeholders. Business plans should be, something that appeals to your customers and appeals to your employees, all of your stakeholders. Business plans are designed for. So internally, business plans are targeted as, sanity check for the entrepreneur because they get too excited and think they're going to take over the world when they really are just going to make a little profit. And an internal check for the startup team so that they know what they're planning on doing and where they're going. But externally, the business plans, it's necessary to get money from your potential investors. So yeah, we have our pitch, things, but some of that comes from the business plan, and maybe they might ask for the business plan after they see the pitch. But you have to have both of them separately. It's hard to write a good canvas if you don't have a business plan, but you're doing it as you're doing the canvas. So a lot of it is overlapping. Usually you have to have a business plan if you're going to ask for any kind of public support. If you're going to get a loan from investors, if you're going to get a loan from a bank, if you're going to get money from anyone, they want to see what your business plan is. They don't want to just say, okay, I'll give you money. Say, what are you going to do with it, right? So they want to see a business plan. And business plan supports the development of alliances with other businesses, okay? Nobody knows if they want to be your partner if they don't know what your plan is. So if you're going to make a partnership and an alliance, they want to see a business plan too. So business plans are important for a lot of people, and it helps you to get big contracts with your customers, but people want to know where you're going and what you plan on doing, what your goals are, if they're going to work with you. Both employees or customers or people giving you funding, all of them want to know what your business plan is if they're going to work with you. You think that, oh, I've got a good product and I go to my customers and they'll buy it from me. It's like, no, people want a lot more than that. They want to know what all of your plans are and where you're going with it. So, you're going to work on your mini business plan, right? And you're going to have a cover slide, a market analysis of 4 to 6 slides. Okay, so we're going to talk about market trends for what you're doing, customer segment and demand profile. Okay, and your product and your service, key characteristics. Okay, but then what are the benefits that customers get out of that? Okay, like you have an early warning, in your product. What's the benefit people get out of that? Why do they care about early warning? Just going to wake them up in the middle of the night, but why do they care about that, right? What's the benefit of that? Competitors, products, and service analysis, and future developments that you want to be working on with your product. What are you going to do for the future? Interesting. I wonder why it's over.
You can read the wind.
Yeah, must be the wind. You can never see ghosts in the daytime. Let's see. Marketing and distribution, you need a plan, part of your plan. How you're gonna advertise, how you're gonna distribute your product. See, ghosts. Channel price, your revenue streams, and CRM, customer relationship management. How are you going to keep in touch with your customers? Is the trouble killing you?
Kéo sản phẩm du lịch.
Nhưng mà
Nó để cái nước cho vào cái kia.
nhưng mà sao năm nay Linh đến không mở được rồi.
Okay, good job. So, you know, what's our business system? What are the key activities we do in our business? What are we, you know, I mean, we're a long ways down before you get to the actual, you know, what are you doing for your system? How's your business going to work? Because that's the other thing, the things that are most important, you know, and there's a reason that, you know, market trends and customer analysis are number one. That should be where you start out in all your planning. When we started on these sheets, you know, the canvas, you should be thinking about customers first, and then everything else should flow from that. So, you know, when you rethink about all your plans and sheets, think about customers and what they want first, and then think all the way through how they would look at everything. Because really, you go nowhere without customers, right? So business systems, what the key activities and key partnerships are going to be, how you're going to manage your enterprise, what your resources are going to cost, what your structure will be, your organizational structure, the charts, you know, showing who people report to. And, you know, so you'll have all of that in your final plan, and then your business canvas as your last slide, okay? So this is what your assignment is. You got, you know, a few weeks to work on it, but it'll take some time to get it done, right? Okay. So let's talk about market analysis some, and some ideas of how to analyze your market. You're not going to become experts in market research overnight or anything, but you can get enough ideas to work on something. Okay. So there's a lot of different ways to analyze the market. You know, you want to know the size of the market you're going after, you know, the total of accessible market, but then, you know, the size of the market that you're going to reach to. So, you know, the size of the market, the growth rate of the sector you're pursuing, development and its strength. How is the economy changing in terms of what you're doing? You know, is technology going to change your product? Okay. What are the social, legal, and environmental factors changing your product? So there's a lot of things to look at that you know, that we want to you know, change for our product. So what are the important elements? Okay, that segment descriptions. Who are you going to target? Okay, who exactly is going to buy this product, right? So we have to think about who, you know, is it, you know, what, is it a demographic segment? Is it a geographic segment? Is it everybody unsegmented? You know, who is going to be the market for this product? And let's describe them and what they look like and what our customer looks like. You know, try and, you know, get a feel, get to know who your customers are. So tell us who's going to buy your product, and, you know, once you tell us who they are, why might be a lot easier. And then what's driving customer demand? Okay. Hello, how are you? Give her some banh mi. So, what are the customers going to do with your product? What jobs do they have done? You know, the word jobs in one of the diagrams we did yesterday or last week. You know, what jobs do the customers have that they want to get done with your product? What's it going to do for them? Okay, and you know, what are their gains and pains that they have related to this product category. Let's get to know those and figure out, like, you know, why? Why are people going to buy our product? Because, well, if you don't know that, you can't sell it very well. You have to know what people want to do with it. And people don't buy products, they buy benefits, okay? So there's two kinds of research that you will, need to know about. Secondary data, okay? This is data that somebody else developed and you're the second user, kind of. That's the way to remember what secondary means. That, people gathered it, they put it in the library, it's on the internet, it's somewhere, and, it could be about demographics of a country, it could be, sales in a certain category that is published by a trade organization, but there's a lot of different types of data out there that you can access. So the advantage is it's inexpensive or even free. A lot of data is free on the internet, a lot of articles are written, but there's also inexpensive data, that's written out there that you can find. So you can find a lot of things that are cheap or, to get, and fast, because you can get it immediately. Some secondary data is very expensive even, like a company called IMS in the pharmaceutical industry. All they do is gather data from doctors and store it. And they have immense amounts of data on doctors and their prescription behavior. And they charge tens of, or hundreds or even, of thousands of US dollars for databases that they sell to pharmaceutical companies who want to do research on who's buying their drugs and their products. So some secondary data is very expensive, but just to get access to it, you can't get it anywhere else. Okay, so it can be inexpensive, it can be expensive, but it's not, it's quick. And, okay. So some problems might be non-availability of the data. You might not see how they gathered the data, you only have the report. So you're not really sure how they got those numbers, how reliable that is, that leads you to. How much can you trust the data? Sometimes, okay, put it this way, look, right now I look at surveys for the election for president in the United States. And I see, like, for state of Pennsylvania, some surveys will come back and say Trump is winning in Pennsylvania. Some surveys come back and say Biden's winning by 10 points in Pennsylvania. Okay, so, you have to think about how much do I trust each one of the organizations that's surveying, and, why are they different? And, secondary data, I didn't gather it, so I have to figure out who I trust and who I don't, and if I'm going to try and make bets on the election. And so we classify the data, how it's classified, how they did their data groupings and things you have no control over. And it's hard to compare data because people do surveys in different ways, they do different scales, they do different samples, so it's really hard to compare data sometimes. In election surveys, for instance, in the US, it's, that's a lot of market research goes into those and trying to predict those. Because there's a difference between, okay, so there's 1,000 people that we survey to see who they want for president. And it comes out, you get results. But wait a minute. Some of them can't vote because they're not old enough. Okay, so we cut them out. Some of them can't vote because they're not U.S. citizens. Okay, so if we surveyed 1,000 people and don't control, we're not going to get valid results for the election, right? Okay. So other ways that, how likely are people to vote? Apathy is a big issue. A lot of people just get fed up with election time and think both candidates are terrible, and they don't even show up to vote. They don't even go to vote. So how motivated and how likely people are to vote is a big issue. And there's a lot of different things enter in. Some surveys take these into account, some surveys don't. And so it's always questionable what the results are if you don't know how they're deciding what their sample is. But I can make a survey and a sample to get you any answer you want. So that's the problem with a lot of these. A lot of these surveys that are published, especially about the election, are meant only as marketing tools. They're not really meant as actual surveys. The actual results they keep private. These are the published results that they're using to try and manipulate the people. And so it's interesting to watch survey results in elections. But same for looking at survey results of anything. You want to, suppose we're going to do a survey of why people come to HUST, okay? We can survey people who are currently here, all right? Well, do you think that's good? We can get you to think and try and tell us why you came here, but you might tell us things that you think of after you've already come, right? Your mind has changed a lot after coming here about, you learned about a lot of different things, or positives and negatives you heard about. So surveying people after they come, after they make a decision, isn't always very valid, okay? After the product experience, people change what they say. If we survey people who are not even thinking about coming here, just the general public, maybe that's not that good of an idea either. What you have to do is survey people while they're making their decision, or when they're at the right state of mind to find out how they make their decision. So you have to, a lot of ways that you can make mistakes in your survey sample, and that's a problem. Okay, and even surveying current students. I talked to someone who did surveys on their opinions of HUST as current students. Freshmen have a different opinion or a different liking of the school than seniors do. Why would that be? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. I think it's probably a honeymoon kind of situation. It's like like a interpersonal relationships. At the very beginning, people are all loving each other and things, but after they get to know each other and know each other's faults, they get to be back to a little bit lower kind of attitude towards each other. But I think, that same effect happens at the university too. When people first come, they think this is the greatest thing in the world, but after a while, it gets calmer. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is, in surveys, you have to worry about who they collected the data from, under what situation, at what point in the purchase process, a lot of different things. And so there's a lot of things to be concerned about. Okay, let's talk about primary data now. Data you collect yourself, okay? All right, then you get to ask the question, the exact question you want. You're asking it right now. So another problem with secondary data, even if they did the survey perfectly, that they did it 5 years ago, the results might not be valid anymore. Has the world changed in 5 years? Yeah, a lot, right? Travel has changed, communications has changed, a lot of technology has changed. Some of us have gotten older, I haven't, but the rest of you have. And so a lot of things have changed in the last 5 years. So, that's one advantage of primary data is it's current, it's recent, it's not outdated, okay? And it's specific to what you want, all right? Disadvantages is it's very expensive to gather your own data. You have to go and do surveys, you have to hire someone to design the survey, you have to analyze the survey. That's gotten a lot easier. Have any of you used online surveys like Qualtrics or anything?
You mean we're doing the surveys or?
Yeah, for doing your own surveys.
No.
No? I don't know if they're in Vietnamese, but they've been around for a good decade. These tools where you can develop your own surveys and then you just send out links to people and they can answer the survey like that. You've never ever used those?
Some
I use it a lot. It's service online.
survey online.
Survey
But I
online?
think here in Vietnam they use Google Docs, so they just send questions and
Google Doc questions? Okay. Huh. Qualtrics is a much better tool, but perhaps it's too expensive for people here. They charge a lot of money for it. But anyway, they're good tools for doing online surveys. And there's another one called SurveyMonkey, which I don't think is a very professional name, but it's very commonly used. Maybe they found it too difficult to translate into Vietnamese, so they didn't pursue the market.
we, as a student, we have to fill a lot of this, but I've never done it myself.
Okay, so you do get some SurveyMonkeys, or
Yes, but some people asked me to do
yeah,
to fill the survey.
yeah, you haven't done it yourself, but it's easy. Let me tell you. So that empowers people to do their own surveys, and if you have a mailing list or a contact list that will respond, then you're doing well. Trouble is, like most people won't click through to respond unless they know who it's coming from, right? So it's very difficult to get people to respond to your survey sometimes. One of my colleagues might want a survey of my class, so, for a project she's working on, but then I can force them to do it during class. But it's hard to get people to respond. So sometimes we offer incentives to people, especially difficult markets. Like if I'm trying to get doctors to do a survey, medical doctors, they're busy and they get paid well, and they don't really want to take the time sometimes. So we pay them money to do surveys. I've seen them paid like $500 for specialists in the U.S. just to do a survey sometimes. I had to do personal interviews of CEOs for one project once, and they got paid $1,000 for an hour, spend an hour with me. Yet they paid them $1,000 just to talk to me, and I thought that was a lot. And a lot of them didn't take the money; they just donated it to charity. But it's fascinating, how hard it is to get people to talk to you in market research sometimes. So some knowledge of getting knowledge of the market is really helpful and gives you a lot of insights. So if you could use SurveyMonkey and make a survey and send it out, great. But still, it's hard to get enough people to respond to it and get a good target market that's going to be answering, that fits who your target market for customers are. So I don't really expect you to be successful at that. If you are, great, good for you. But that's really hard to do in a week, or 2 weeks, I guess. And so we'll have to be more casual, use as much secondary research as you can, and maybe do some qualitative research. There's quantitative research and qualitative research also. And in quantitative research, we're doing surveys and we're getting numbers back about how people rate. Okay, all the time, whenever you take, Grab, it asks you rate on a scale of 1 to 10 what your driver was or whatever, and how your food was and things like that. Well, okay, so they get a lot of quantitative scores. But there's also qualitative data. Qualitative means I'm talking to people and I'm asking them to talk back to me. I have a conversation with them. I say, well, what is it you liked about your driver? What is it you didn't like about your driver? Get them to discuss things and tell us what could be better next time. All these kind of things. So getting people to tell you things in their own words is more qualitative data. And there's a trade-off there. There's a trade-off between lots of data, which you can get from the new numbered surveys, or the quality of data. You can get qualitative data. You're really talking to people, and they're able to express themselves, and you're sure of what's going on in their heads. When people give you a number, you don't really know what it means or why they gave you a 4 or a 6 or an 8. You just know that's what they gave you. And so, when they give you qualitative results, an answer, tell you why or what they really think, that gives you a better, deeper understanding of them. A smaller sample of qualitative data is, to me, more valuable than a large sample of quantitative data because it gives me enough ideas of knowing where to go in direction. Usually, big companies will do 2 stages of research. They'll do qualitative data in order to get questions, and get ideas of what's important to customers. Then they'll do survey data to try and get an exact number of, of how much each thing is important to customers. So they try and do 2 stages of research. One, just to find out the things people think about, and then 2, to find out how they rate those things in terms of most important. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay. So secondary data, if the question's answered, then we go on to data evaluation reporting. If it's not, then we'll do some, look for some more secondary data, and if that still doesn't answer a question, then we'll try and do some primary data, and if that works, then we're done. If not, we go back and try again. But sometimes you don't get the answers to your question, and you have to use your expert judgment on things too. And so that's what entrepreneurs have to do a lot, because if they're inventing a new product, customers can't really give you good ratings of it because they've never seen it, they never tried it, they don't know, how it works, and so it's more difficult for them. So sometimes you just have to go with your feel, but you want to get at least an idea of what you can from the customers. So there's a lot of different websites that you can get market information from. There's some examples here about different places. Let's see, one, I wonder if we can access it here. They might have blocked it. Can somebody have the laptop hooked to the internet?
Có Mac.
Are you logged into Wi-Fi?
We have our personal.
Yeah, are you logged into Wi-Fi? All right, I'll do it from here. I want to see if I can access.
Thay nhưng hơi yếu nhưng mà vẫn phát được. Có mạng cá nhân mà.
Very slow connection. Let me try it. Wrong one.
Còn đây có mạng cá nhân đấy, Tom's phone.
Yeah, eat those all up.
Ôi, hôm nay không có đá chơi mệt mỏi. Hôm nay không có đá chơi mệt mỏi. Thôi thì nghe bài là Trương Mỹ Lan tự mình.
Okay. Here's a cool resource for doing information about different countries if you're doing international business. It's put out by the CIA from the U.S. so you can feel like you're a spy. But it's the CIA World Fact Book. And they have information about political stability, history, government, all sorts of information about different countries around the world. So, let's see. Want to pick a country? What country do you want to know about? Vietnam? Cambodia?
Laos.
What?
Laos.
Laos.
America.
Laos is closer.
CIA.
Alright, so look at these categories. Which do you want to know about?
Economy.
Okay. socialist Southeast Asian economy, one of the fastest growing economies, declining but still high poverty, new anti-corruption efforts. Oh, I saw that they're going to execute a woman from Saigon. Yeah. And it's funny, the article I read about her said exactly what my friend said, that she used to have cars delivering money to her house every day. And the article said that too. She had a basement full of money. So anyway, they have a lot of things going on there, but it's a great source for learning about countries. And let's see, inflation rate, what's their inflation rate? Pretty high, 23% in 2022.
CCC.
So let's see, major industries are mining, timber. So like a lot of developing nations, their major industries are just exporting natural resources. And but then they do some garments, cement, and tourism. So okay. So anyway, Laos. How big is our labor force? 3 million.
Nhưng mà xem cái này là xem cái gì nhé.
Anyway, it's an interesting place to get information. But and then if you want the U.S., somebody said, "Oh, I want U.S. data," then you can go to the U.S. Census Bureau, and they have tons of information about. Oh, okay, here we go. The access denied gate. They won't. I'm not sure if it's the U.S. Blocking it or if it's Vietnam blocking it. I think it's Vietnam, but you have to use a VPN to get through to that. Which I could turn on my VPN right now, I guess, and do it. Let's see.
VPN. Thầy không vào được census government.
Okay. So it's funny, like really weird things are blocked in the U.S. sometimes, like little county courthouses are blocked and stuff. It's really rather silly that the Vietnam government worries about that because it's so easy to get around it, right? Anybody can.
BBC.
So U.S. Census data, you can get lots of information about demographics and population of the U.S. in anywhere, and so it's a good place if you want to try and find out what cities are growing fast and how what's going on. So they've got data profiles of all these different states and counties and all over the country. So anyway, that's just a data source about demographics in the U.S. What's the top population? How about that? See, a lot of things come in spreadsheet format, so this is a population of every state in the United States. And so that's interesting to know. Arizona, Arkansas. California is the biggest state with 39 million people. pretty big with 20 million. Texas is second largest with 29 million people. So anyway, you can get a lot of different population by a lot of different reports of different population studies across the United States. All of these different things are different reports. So it's an interesting place to play around with if you're marketing in the U.S. and you want to know numbers. You can get breakdowns by age and breakdowns by location. So, for instance, once 8 years ago, I wanted to do estimates of people who were going to be recruitable, basically, for coming to my college. And so I could use these to predict the number of people that would be 18 to 22 years old in every year for the next 10 years and graph that out to show the dip in the number of eligible people or the rise in number. So you can do that to try and predict a lot of different things like that. So it's interesting, but back to other stuff. So that's how you find out stuff about the U.S. Okay, but here's some other things about Canada and about Europe. But there's tons of places. If you're good at searching with Google, you can find out a lot of things. And possibly the most difficult thing in Vietnam is knowing good search terms to put into Google to get it to find things for you, because it doesn't always translate well. Have you used some of the new AI search bots for searching?
Like ChatGPT.
Yeah, like that. I think there's one. One of my browsers has something called Ask Leo or something, but all of them have different ones, and they seem to be pretty good. They're pretty good at finding references and summarizing things for you. Other secondary data comes from reports that are listed in the stock exchange. You can look at the annual report, audited reports of companies, and they have to give reports in their business. They have to sign a name on it. And if it's not true, they can go to jail. So, they try and make that pretty valid and accurate. There was a company, 15 or 20 years ago called Enron in Texas. And the owners of that company went to jail, and the auditing company, who was approving their documents, lost their license and got disbanded. Arthur Andersen used to be one of the biggest accounting firms in the U.S., and they're not there anymore because they messed up. They were so corrupt in signing off on things they shouldn't have that they lost their authorization to be an accounting firm. And so both these founders of Enron went to jail and died there, I think. And so it's interesting, but people have to seriously be honest on their annual reports. So you can look at these annual reports and get information about companies, and it's often available on websites, so you can find out what sales growth was, and other things from their annual reports. Trade fair catalogs. Lots of times there'll be catalogs of what's shown at trade fairs, and you can get good information about what competitors are doing. And lots of times if I have a new product, and suppose I'm making new kitchen brushes. Okay, you wouldn't believe the variety of kitchen brushes there are in the U.S. But I'm making new kitchen brushes. Do I want to put all the photos of them and everything out on the internet? Well, if they're brand new and I'm trying to convince people to buy them because they're better, because they've got better handles, if I put them out on the internet, guess what? Everybody copies them right away. Okay, so some things you have to kind of keep private. But catalogs, you can get ideas what all the competitors are doing and figure out how to do something better or different. Business associations will put out publications, reports about the markets, and they're not always available online, but you might have to call them to get them to send them to you, or email them. You might have to pay a few dollars to get them, but these these publications can be valuable. Lots of times I've seen them. You might have to pay whatever amount of money to get them, but they're worth it compared to trying to get the data yourself. Okay. Rule 1, techniques to gain consumer insights, okay? First off, you have to have a beginner's mind. You have to think, I don't really know anything about this. You have to forget all your opinions and listen to what your customer says, okay? What you think doesn't matter. You have to, explore, your customers and talk to them and find out what they expect their jobs to be, what they expect the pains and gains, to be. And, try not to put your own interpretation on them. Try and get if you're not sure what they said, ask them to explain. But get all the information from your customer, not from, your own opinion. And that's very difficult to do if you're asking somebody about what they think about, or why they want to do something, and they tell you something that's totally wrong. Like if you're trying to ask people, why would you not go to HUST? And well, because it's a little tiny school out in the country. And you're biting your lip thinking of saying, no, it's not. It's in the middle of Hanoi. But you don't want to do that. If you're talking to people and getting research from them, what you're interested in is finding out what they know and what they think. And if you go back and find out that you've got a lot of misinformation to clear up and a lot of education to do with customers, that's still a learning. But you don't want to be leading your customer in what they're saying, because you won't get anywhere that way. So you have to listen more than you talk. I know for some people that's very, very difficult, but trying to listen to people more than you talk and find out what they think, that's really a key effort. Once I was hired to do a study for Harrah's Casinos. Harrah's is a big casino operator in the U.S. They have casinos in several places. And I did, I think, 80 one-hour interviews with gamblers that go to their casinos, and just had to ask them why they started gambling and why they liked the one casino over another and things. And listening to 80 hours of people tell me about why they're gamblers was pretty depressing, let me tell you, because they all started because they had problems they were trying to forget. And I had to listen to a woman talking about watching her son die of cancer and how she went to the casino to forget about that, and different similar stories all across the board. So, but you have to listen more than you talk. So you ask the questions and you let people talk. So sometimes you're like a therapist and just getting people to talk to you and let them go on for a long time telling you about what they see as what they need and why they like things and stuff. And it's very interesting. I kind of feel like I'm qualified to be a therapist now, but I don't do that. So you want to get facts, not opinions. So sometimes you get people's opinions, but I think opinions are important too. So I don't know, facts are good. Get facts when you can, but also get opinions too. But when you get an opinion, ask people why they think that. Know why. Every person is a scientist. Every human being is a scientist. They all gather evidence, they make hypotheses, they test their hypothesis, they make conclusions. Anytime you do any decision making, you're using your information you have, you're making a theory, and then you're making a decision based on that. And so when we ask people why they have an opinion, They have evidence that they base their opinion on, so we want to find out what that is. If we find out how people are making their opinions, we can influence them. We can, go to that source and, change that source if their opinions change. But those are things we need to find out. If high school students are getting their opinions about where to go to college from the cheerleaders, we'll go and talk to all the cheerleaders and can give them scholarships to come to our college, because then they'll tell people how great we are. But we try and find out how people are formulating their opinions, and then go out and help them. One thing you want to avoid also is you want to avoid thinking all right? If thinking I know that cheerleaders matter. Okay, no, let's talk to the actual customers and see who matters when they're making their opinions. Who's influencing them if we want to find opinion leaders? But we have to ask those questions and get them from our customers. Never assume you know. You think the smartest people in the class are the ones that shape others' opinions of where to go to class or where to go to college? Every school has okay, you all went to high school, right? Most of you. And there's always one person that's like super smart, okay? Smarter than everybody else, okay? And, nobody likes them. And, okay, so there's one smart person nobody likes. Is that the person that everybody makes their opinion from on where to go to college? Do you go to that person and ask them for advice on where to go to college? No, not usually. They might know the most, but they're not the opinion leader. So we want to find out who the opinion leaders were. Like, when I was in high school, I was very good at a certain sport. And somebody 2 years older than me that was very good at that got a scholarship to college, and I just applied to that same college and I went there. And so, people do very naive things sometimes, but it works out. All right, you have to remember, to ask why. All right, very important to understand people's motivations when you're doing research. We want to figure out do you like A better than B? That's nice to know, but what I really want to know is why you like A better than B. Because then I can change my product to be more like A, or I can make my product better than A. And so I want to know the things that are driving their decision making, driving their choice. So it's about learning, and not selling. We're trying to learn how people make decisions. We're trying to learn what drives them, what makes them, want something more than another. What are the things what are the needs they have that aren't being satisfied? So we're trying to really learn from people. And so we don't want to tell them solutions too early. We want to get them to talk about things they need. And, the best new products always come from your customers. The best place to get new product ideas comes from your customers. So we want to interview them and not give them new product ideas to evaluate right away. We want to ask them what new product ideas they have, what they'd like to see. And then at the end of maybe of a discussion, then we would talk to them about what our new product is. Because if we tell them what ours is first, then they never get around. It changes what they think theirs is. So we can get new ideas from them. Then at the last part of the interview, we'll tell them what ours is and ask them what they think or what they would change on it. And then follow up, ask for contact info. Sometimes you can follow up. I don't think that's that important. I think usually once you've interviewed them once, you don't usually follow up, because once you've interviewed them, you've contaminated them. All of their opinions will be changed because you interviewed them. This is a well-known research fact that once you've measured someone with an interview, then if you measure them next week, it's going to be different because of the interview. Just the fact of interviewing someone and asking them questions changes how they think. One paper I did on satisfaction with car dealership services, and we found that just interviewing people about satisfaction, if we went back and measured their attitude towards the car dealer a month later, they liked the car dealer much better a month later because we interviewed them. Okay, just the fact of interviewing them made them feel that we cared more, and so they, gave us high. They felt better about us later. So measuring people, interviewing people, has an effect on their attitude. So you can't compare results. So you don't want to interview people twice because that first interview changes how they think. Did that make sense to you?
Right.
Yeah. Focus groups are something that people use a lot, and they're not that great, okay? I'll tell you, they're not that great. I've done focus groups and I've done one-on-one interviews because, you have to do what your client wants. I don't usually want to do focus groups, but if the client says they want focus groups and they're paying me, okay, I'll do them. The client's right. And so in a focus group, you'll get 7 to 12 people in a room, and you'll talk to them all at the same time and ask them questions and things, or 6 to 10, it says on my notes here, but you get a group of people in a room and you talk to them and ask them questions. So we give them a gift or a payment. Maybe we'll give them $100 or something for coming and talking to us for 2 hours. And okay, so great. And a moderator, that would be me. I would go in and be in the room, and I would ask them questions and make sure all the topics get covered in the session. So usually marketing managers are observing the session and using cameras or two-way mirrors. So they're watching as the interviews go on. They're behind the wall, behind the mirror, watching the interviews. And they'll give us some insights, but they're not that representative because there's not that many people, right? 10 people. And let's say there's 10. And it's a 2-hour interview. That's 120 minutes, right? So, and the narrator is talking for, 1/3 the time, explaining things to them. So, how much time is left then out of 120? 2/3 of that is 80 minutes, right? If you have 10 people and 80 minutes, how many, about 8 minutes a person, right? So on average, each person in a focus group gets to talk to you for 8 minutes. Not that much, really, when you think about it. So in a focus group, you have this illusion. It's an illusion of talking to all these people for 2 hours. Each one of them can only talk to you for 8 minutes. And so you're not getting that much information from them at all. Second criticism I have of focus groups. When one person talks, everybody else nods that, yeah, that's right. Okay? It's like when somebody in here has an opinion, in class, everybody will say, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, let's do that. Okay? And so people build, they build on each other's ideas. Now, if you're trying to develop new ideas, and maybe that might be useful when you want people to build on each other's ideas and to develop ideas and to brainstorm, then it might be useful. But if you're trying to get opinions on why people do things, it's not very useful. Okay, you get biased opinions, you don't get the real opinions. People change their mind when they hear other people talk, and you're not hearing the truth. And sometimes people don't want to admit what their opinions are because they think they sound stupid. Sometimes they do sound stupid, but they don't want to say it in front of others because of that, right? If I started asking you questions about economics, some of you wouldn't want to answer because you'd be afraid of you might give the wrong answer and not sound incredibly smart, right? And so
That's true.
yeah, so that's what a focus group is. That we try and you're asking people questions in front of everyone else, and it intimidates. On the other hand, propose that It's much better. If you're gonna have 10 people, have your interviewer, instead of spending 2 hours talking to people, have them spend 10 hours. Let them sit there all day. That's what he gets paid for, come on. Let them sit there all day and have 10 people come in one at a time. And talk to them for an hour each, or half hour each. Talk to each one of them for half hour, okay? Talking to each one of them, making them talk for 30 minutes. Think about it, that's like 4 times as much talking as they were gonna do in the focus group. And you'll get a lot more detailed and a lot more in-depth and a lot more honest information from people. So I think individual, personal conversations are personal interviews are much more effective and valuable and much more cost effective for what you get from them than focus groups. Focus groups, you often end up getting, what the client wants to hear, okay? Advertisers like to do focus groups to test advertisements because they can manipulate people into saying the ads sound good because that's what they want. They want somebody to tell them the ad sounds good. But it's not a very valid way to do research. So there's my opinions on focus groups. One of the most common techniques used in market research and one of the worst. That's my opinion. Because personal interviews are so much better. So there's a lot of different quantitative methods of doing data collection. Okay, there's, you can do mail surveys, you can do internet surveys, telephone surveys, or personal interviews, in-person interviews. Mail surveys, I don't know, mailing out things, that just doesn't work very well. In the U.S., everybody has a mailbox and a mail service to get things mailed. I don't know if you even have a mail service. Do you have a national mail service here? Not really, right? You just have a lot of private delivery services. Yeah, so they could do private deliveries to you, but that's kind of weird. But in the U.S. you have national mail services that are, the government owns a mail service, and I can send a letter or things to anyone, and I don't know, it might cost 50 cents or $1 to send somebody a letter anywhere in the country. But but people don't respond well, and people throw them away most of the time, so it's not really that effective. So internet, works better, it's flexible, okay? You can't get in-depth information of really getting people to tell you what they think. Sure, you can ask a question, why did you say that? And how many times do you get asked when you get a survey question that says, was your delivery good? Okay, why do you say that? And do you spend a lot of time giving them feedback? No. And I buy cheap stuff on Lazada, right? Okay, and it sent me a survey afterwards. How is this product? Tell us what you think of it. Do you think I spend a lot of time typing in things about the product? No. There are all these reviews there, people saying wonderful things about it. Well, they must be the cousin of the people who have the website or something. I don't know why people would spend that much time doing it. But it's, the internet, qualitative feedback is pretty weak usually because people don't really give you a lot unless you're really prompting them. Telephone in surveys, if we can get people to talk to us on the phone, we can get more information from them then and have more of a personal conversation. Response rate on that has gone down a lot because people don't talk to strangers. Do you answer the phone if it's a number you don't know? No.
Sometimes.
I do because I don't know anybody. But when I get a Vietnamese number, I answer. It's usually a delivery trying to come to my house. But that's the only time you answer them is when somebody's delivering something or something. But you don't do surveys over the phone usually. People are too rushed. Personal interviews, when you could sit down and talk to somebody face to face for a while, you can get them to complete the questionnaire, you get them to actually have a conversation and answer questions with you. Well, they're the most effective way to get in-depth information. You can give people good visual aids. It's hard to get it out across a lot of people, so you can't get a widespread dispersion. So you can't, do it, get 10,000 people to measure different provinces and things of that nature. Response rate, well, it's hard to get people to do interviews. So it's, a lot of things are difficult. Asking sensitive questions like personal hygiene questions and things. Maybe a blind survey on the internet or somewhere might be better than, or a paper survey they can mail in might be better than talking to them in person. People get a little bit shy about talking about personal problems, right? Interviewer effects. Okay, here's a place where personal interviews fail. It's hard to get interviewers who are totally blank, that they don't lead the consumer with their own personal responses or facial expressions or anything to try and, to not try, but somehow influence the interview. Isn't it hard to keep a straight face when you ask people questions and they give you weird answers? It's like you want to tell them, no, that's not right, but you have to hold back and tell them other things and, just go along with the flow. And so it's hard to be, just a machine basically and be a good interviewer. So the interviewer has effects on the person you're interviewing. Their need for approval. People have a lot of people have a high need for approval. Not everyone, but a lot. And they're always trying to get other people to approve of them. And so when they have an interviewer in front of them, they might say, yes, I like something, when they don't, just because they think the interviewer wants to hear that. Okay? They say things they think they want the interviewer to hear. So the interviewer can be biased in a lot of ways, or can cause bias in responses without really trying. I think that's why I was really good at doing interviews, because nobody ever wanted to please me. It's a joke. Anyway, speed of data collection. Okay, mail surveys are very slow. If you send things out to people and ask them to send it back, then it takes forever, right? And so, they might never send it back. Internet surveys are pretty fast usually. People click through and go right to the internet survey. Telephone surveys are usually very fast. Most of the election surveys are done internet or on the internet now. They used to be telephone, but most of them are done either internet or telephone to try and get results back very quickly. And so these are great for getting good, quick responses. The election surveys are interesting. That's another way sample gets biased. Okay. All right. When you think about it, okay, who answers the phone and has time to do a survey? Do you all work for a living? Most of you, right? Do you have time to answer the phone and do a survey?
Not really.
No. You're busy, right? And then all your free time is spent studying for classes. So. You don't have time to do a survey. So who is it that would do surveys?
Unemployed.
Yeah, unemployed people, retired people, but not your regular working people. So that's another problem of built-in bias in the sample sometimes of a lot of surveys. That it's hard trying to weight your sample to figure out who they represent, and if you're representing everyone properly is a very big science in doing survey work, because you want to make sure you get enough people in every category, and make sure they're not just all people unemployed on welfare, because they're going to vote for certain things, whereas other people vote for other things, right? So like all income tax in the U.S., for example, that 51 or 52% of the population of the U.S. of the working age population pay zero income tax because they don't work enough to meet the minimum qualification. So half the people in the country pay no income tax, okay? So if those are the people that you target with your survey, they're going to support the candidate that says raise taxes because they're not paying them anyway. So they're happy to raise taxes on the rest of the people. So so sometimes if you're reaching the people who aren't working with your survey, they tell you they're going to support candidates that are totally different than what the other half of the population thinks. So it's a lot of interesting biases that can creep in surveys. Anyway, it's interesting. So yeah, it's interesting that half the population in the U.S. don't pay income tax, right?
I think it's pretty much the same over here because we have two payslips. The one that we have the social insurance and personal tax, and then the other one that we get from the company.
Okay. And if they make too low a salary, they don't pay any.
Right. So normally they make only more than $5 million, and it's below 13 million if you don't pay tax.
And on one hand, I don't think they should pay taxes because they need to live. Okay, if they're not making enough money, they should have to be able to keep what they make to live. But on the other hand, like when you do a survey, and that's all the people, if they're the only ones you survey, they're going to be biased in one way in terms of their stance on taxes, right? You don't have to worry about elections here, but still, it's a bias that you would get in survey results. All right. So when we look at segments and buying behavior, I wonder if I can do this. Oh, okay. There are like 4 ways we can segment people mainly. Okay. There's a geographic segmentation, where people are, where they live, where they work. Okay. So what are some of the different geographic ways you could segment people in Vietnam? Well, North or South, right? South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese. I hear a lot of discussion about that. The Southern Vietnamese don't speak Vietnamese properly and things, and they don't pronounce properly. I hear it all. And so we could segment by North and South. We could segment by province, but there's too many provinces, and it's too hard to. There's not much difference between a lot of them, right? Okay. And so, what other ways can you segment in Vietnam? What other ways could you segment geographically besides North and South?
People live in rural area and urban population.
Okay, very good. Like people who are rural or urban. Okay. If you live in Hanoi, you're very sophisticated and worldly and think differently than people that live in the country, perhaps. Or I don't know, but some of the country seems pretty sophisticated too. But that they have different tastes and different lifestyles, right? Okay. What else? Anything else you can think of by location? If they live by the coast or live by the mountains, whatever. But there's a few different ways to geographically segment, but not that many. How about within Hanoi? How about even within Hanoi? Just to take the city. How can you geographically segment people within Hanoi? Can you divide them into different groups that respond differently?
I think education level, the jobs.
Okay. All right. By education we could, but I meant just by geography right now. Just by location within Hanoi.
Central district.
Okay. The central district, like Hun Kim and things, have
four district, 4 central district.
Yeah, those districts will be different. Dong Da is a little bit different than Hun Kim, then I don't know the other districts very well, but are there some districts that are more lower income and some districts that are more higher income? So you can use geographic segmentation to target people in different areas based on the characteristics of those areas. So that's one one way to use geographic, even within the city. In New York, you can segment people by their postal code. You know, like every part of the city has a different postal code. And if you segment people that way, you can really find big differences in income from one postal code to another, and you know, target people for different products and put different restaurants in different areas and things, just based on you know, where people live. In California now, they're going to have to start putting McDonald's in the higher income area because it's getting so expensive to eat at McDonald's. Inflation is running away in the U.S., but they did, you know, a very crazy thing when they just implemented a law this week where they have to pay $20 an hour to anybody working at a fast food restaurant there. $20 an hour, that's a lot of money, you know, and even in U.S. And so they're going to be raising all the prices. Like I saw one, you know, picture of a combo meal at McDonald's just for one person was $25 at one place. And so it's going to be kind of crazy, the inflation that's going on there. But a lot of people are going to be laid off, and they have like these, I think the right word is idiots, that are campaigning for this raise and, you know, and think it's going to help the workers. What's happening already and quickly is a lot of people are losing their jobs because businesses can't afford to pay this, you know, and still offer a product at a reasonable price. I think the people who are really the winners are the high-tech companies in California, and they're probably behind the scenes paying to get this law passed, because what it's going to happen is a big increase in robotics in all the fast food restaurants in the U.S. will occur. We'll see, you know, burgers being made by robots in the back and French fries being made by robots, and they're going to cut their staff way down to just one or two people. When you order, you'll order by a touchpad and pay by credit card, and you won't deal with any people, you know, very few people at all. And so the big winners are going to be the high-tech companies. So although they pretend to have these liberal, you know, we fight for workers groups that are fighting to get this $20 an hour thing, I think it's really probably the high-tech people that are behind the scenes pushing that through, because they're the only winner that I can see. I mean, the people that are working there are going to all lose their jobs, so it's very sad. But anyway, by targeting neighborhoods where people have enough expendable income for your product is what I was getting back at, you know, by geographic segmentation. So, like, if you're going to open McDonald's, what region, what geographic area would you target for a McDonald's for sure in Hanoi?
Crowded areas.
What?
Crowded area.
Crowded area? How about maybe, I don't know, international areas where a lot of foreigners are? Do you think that works?
Just for those areas.
Yeah, like Westlake maybe?
It's the lake.
Yeah, and okay, and other crowded areas, because they seem to have a good reputation for Vietnam. You know, in the U.S., McDonald's doesn't sell chicken, but it's a big product here, it seems like. It's one of their main things. So anyway, we try and do crowded areas, we try and do areas where people have enough income to pay for our product, and try and avoid the poor areas. What are some of the lower income areas of Hanoi? I probably don't go to them, so. Are there any?
In Hon Kim, but it's outside of the center. It's on
Okay.
Long Bien. It's under the Long Bien Bridge.
What bridge?
It's called Phúc Xá.
Phúc Xá.
Right. So I was a volunteer over there. I teach kids from very
Okay.
poor families.
And I'll guarantee you there's no McDonald's around there or Pizza Huts, because
Just
they
only-
charge high prices and those people won't be buying it. Right?
Just dumping Zen. Dumping Zen is like people's rights.
Yeah. So anyway, even in the city they can do geographic segmentation. If you're opening like language store, you know, like language teaching studios, I see a lot of those around Apollo and Ames and Spiders and things.
Wait a lot.
But, yeah, there are a lot of them around, I see them. And those are all in the higher income neighborhoods because that's where people can afford to pay for that for their children. So that's what geographic, works on a big level in the state, but it works on a really good level even within the city of trying to target different provinces or different, what do you call the different areas of precincts or what? Like Dongda is what? No name for it? Oh.
What do you mean?
Oh, what do you call the different areas of Hanoi? Do you call them precincts or what do you call the different?
I think it's district.
Districts, okay. So different districts. You can target different districts based on their wealth, but what else? Their demographics of how ethnic mix. When I was talking about Westlake or Honkien, they have different ethnic mixes for your products. Honkien, you actually have a high income international ethnic mix because that's where all the tourists come. And it's not that all the people in China are rich, but the ones that can afford to travel a lot are a little bit richer than the other ones. And so they, that's people have money to spend there. And so they, you can open up expensive things there. I think the most expensive restaurant I've seen was just looking at the menu outside of a steak place in Honkien because they're getting people who can afford to pay it. Let's see. So geographic works on a lot of levels, I guess is what I'm saying. By wealth, by ethnic mix, and by age sometimes. Sometimes some areas have a lot more young people than others, and so that's another way to target things. I walked by a school, the other day when I got for a walk. I found all of a sudden I'm walking by like 10 ice cream shops in a row, and then I see why across the street's a big school with all the, like 14 and 12-year-olds getting out of school. It's like they all come over and get fat from the ice cream, and so geographic works very well by targeting either areas or things close to something or things of that nature. Okay. Demographic, you combine that with geographic, as I was just saying, they use the demographics to target different geographic areas. So you might be deciding that you want to target older adults whose children have grown and moved out. We call them empty nesters. And what do we target empty nesters for? What kind of products do they buy, you think? So they have more disposable income because they don't have to pay for their kids anymore, and they don't have as many responsibilities, and they just the two of them living together. What do we target empty nesters for?
Health products.
Okay, we'd like them to be healthy, health products. I don't get too many ads for them, but I should. Okay, so we might target them with health products. What else?
Holidays.
Vacations, travel. Okay, this is a big thing for empty nesters. Most cruise ships are filled up with old people. Okay, lots of times empty nesters, sometimes single old people, but lots of old people go on cruise ships and cruises because they don't have to worry about kids at home anymore. They've got more money because they don't have to be putting the kids through private schools anymore. And so empty nesters are people we target for a lot of things for vacations and such. If you have kids you have to pick up and drop off at school every day, you can't go on a cruise. Doesn't matter how much money you have, you're stuck. And so empty nesters are a big market for a lot of luxury items. Sometimes sports cars, sometimes cruises, maybe trips to Hanoi, I don't know. But they're a good market target, along with single people, of course. So Okay, so luxury items and things we target empty nesters for. If they're really old, somebody was saying they give them home health care kind of things, or home care kind of somebody to come and watch them. I don't know, I had lunch with another professor and she was suggesting I get someone to come and do home care for me, and I'm not sure if I should be insulted by that or not. But anyway, let's see. So demographics are another way we do things. Looking at number of people in a family. If you have, if there's a family with 3 kids, do they have other concerns, or are there other products they want to buy? Like, keeping the air clean might be more important if you have children. And you find that when you're old and you had kids, it's like you're much more concerned about the health products for your kids than you are about yourself. Like for me, people say, "Oh, eat this organic food." It's like, why? So I don't get cancer in 50 years? Well, I'm not worried about it. All right, but for my kid that's 12 or 10, I say, yes, that's a good idea, so they can grow up and be healthy. So we're much more concerned about the health products, both air, water, food, for children than we are for adults. So they're a good target for air filters and things of that nature. People with families and small children who want their kids to grow up healthy. Okay, so demographic, we can, a lot of different products are targeted that way. Of course, food products and things, have different demographic targets. Behavioral segmentation, how much people use. People use a lot of our product. We want to target them and make sure they're happy and stay with us. Light users and heavy users are different targets. Why people are buying a product. If they're buying a car, okay, why are they buying the car? Are they buying it, to haul kids around? Are they buying it to look good? Are they buying it just to get to work by themselves? There's different reasons people buy a car, and so that's the benefits they're seeking. Okay, let's see. Loyalty status. Okay, how loyal are they? Did I tell you about Coke and Pepsi and how they destroyed loyalty last week? No? You want me to? Yeah. Okay. Old stories. Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola were 2 big brands in the U.S. and still are, and they both had very loyal customers. Okay, they were very loyal. Coke customers would only buy Coke. If Coke wasn't available, they say, "Oh, we don't have Coke. Would you like orange?" They'd say, "No, give me orange." They wouldn't take Pepsi. They would say, "No." They turn down Pepsi. Give me orange. They ask a Pepsi drinker, "You want a Coke?" They said, "No way, no way. Give me water." So they would refuse, the other brand because they were so loyal. They had a personal identity, attached to those brands. And really kind of amazing how much identity they had, because it was part of their heritage of growing up and drinking that product with their grandparents and whatever. So they had a lot of personal identity wrapped up in these brands. And the companies noticed that people were very loyal to their brands, and they said, well, let's try and get, those Pepsi users to switch to Coke and be loyal to us. Because, we assume that if they try Coke, at least half of them will like Coke and they'll stay with us. And the Pepsi management thought the same thing. So let's try and get those Coke users to switch to us, because if they try us, they'll like us and they won't go back to Coke, because we're better than them. They both thought they were better than the other one. And so they said, how do we get people to try our product? All right, let's run a sale. They cut the price in half for Coke for one weekend. 12-pack of cans for whatever, really low price. And people that normally wouldn't buy Coke say, I can't resist it. Let me buy it and try it out. So Pepsi buyers would try out the Coke and they say, oh, yeah, you're right, it's not so bad. And the next week, Pepsi would run a sale, and so they'd go back to they bought Pepsi, and some of the Coke buyers would try the Pepsi. Oh, that's not so bad. And so it was working. They were getting people to, in one way, they were getting people to try the other product by doing these price promotions and cutting their price way down. And so they're getting people to try the other products, okay? All the while losing profits because they lowered their price, right? And so they run these sales and get people to try the other products. Great. What do you think went wrong?
Is that game theory problem?
They what?
I think it's game theory problem.
Well, I could frame everything as a game theory, but the problem is how people are making their decision. Before, people were making their decision based on, I'm loyal to Coke, that's what I'm buying. They had very simple decision rule, right? This is what I buy, Pepsi's what I don't buy. Okay, but we changed them. We changed the people. We made them think, okay, oh, both products are good. What did they buy? What do you think they bought, next time around? Whatever's cheapest. They started buying the cheapest. They became loyal to price. Since they found out the products are about the same, they became loyal to price and bought the cheapest one every week instead of buying, the brand that they used to be loyal to. And they actually taught their customers to not be loyal anymore. They became loyal to price instead of the brand. And they lost a lot of profit because people weren't paying. That part of their customers, not all of them, but that part weren't willing to pay a premium for their product anymore, and so they lost money from them. And also, they lost market share because there's a third brand in the U.S. called RC Cola, not very well known, doesn't advertise as much. But people, 3 months later, Coke and Pepsi prices were both high, and RC was low, and so all these people who became price sensitive started drinking RC Cola, and they found out, they like that. And actually, when they did taste tests, blind taste tests, they found out that people actually like RC Cola better than Coke and Pepsi, even though it has a smaller market share. So they actually taught people to switch brands and taught them to switch to this third brand. So it wasn't even a total sum game when they just switched back and forth. They both lost because they went to a third brand. So it was a real catastrophe trying to have a price war to steal from your major competitor because you both end up losing that way. You should find other ways to war with people. Anyway, that's my Coke Pepsi story for today. I can come up with other ones later. But it's an interesting way to destroy loyalty. Doing advertising low price is a great way to destroy loyalty. When I lived in New Jersey, in the U.S., they used to, I got coupons for pizza every week. Every week without fail, I'd get shoved in my door coupons, $5 off for pizza here, $10 off here, half price there. And all the time. And what I learned was never, they thought, okay, if you're running a pizza place and you send out coupons, what's your goal? You want to get me to try your pizza place, right? That's why you give me coupons, because you think, I'll try it, I'll like it, and I'll keep coming back. That's the goal of coupons for a restaurant, right? You want to get people to try it, and then like it, and come back. Okay? So when they started all doing coupons, I learned to be coupon sensitive. I wouldn't buy a pizza unless I had a coupon. If the place I liked last week didn't have coupons, I'd switch to a different place that gave me a coupon. So I was always switching, to whatever the cheapest one was based on coupons. So they taught us to be coupon sensitive by doing too much couponing. Second mistake that restaurants make is they'll do a promotion, a price promotion, say, great special, buy this, 7 pieces of chicken for, $100K or something, okay? Which sounds like a good deal, and you buy it, and they give you little tiny pieces. And, you say, I thought I was getting 7 pieces, and they cheated you. And so what they, a lot of people say, we'll give them the special, but then we'll give them a smaller product so that they, so doesn't cost us as much, and we won't lose money. Well, that doesn't achieve their goal. What they're trying to do is get people to try it so they'll like it and come back. What they do is get people to try it, and then they didn't like it, and they don't come back. And so that becomes the problem for them. So I've seen that happen in restaurants in the U.S. and, happened here to me and things. And so it's sad when I see people trying to do promotions to get people to try a product and then skimping on quality and actually doing the opposite of what they want them to do. So anyway, psychographics, personality and lifestyle and how people think about things. All right. Let's see. Somebody was talking about eco straws or straws made out of bamboo or straws of decomposable material. And there's a company around Hanoi that makes those and is trying to export them to the U.S. recently. And they're interesting product, right? Okay. And if you make them out of rice, maybe they'd be edible. Great. But eco straws are an interesting product. But what kind of psychographics would we have for those customers? We would use psychographics, how people think, right? Why would customers ask for an eco straw? Why would you ask for eco straws at McDonald's?
I think they would save the environment.
Okay, saving the environment. In some cities in California and other parts of the U.S., they've made plastic straws illegal because they're worried about all the pollution in the ocean, and it is a significant concern. Some places you go swimming in the ocean and it's full of plastic. It's no fun. It's not good for the fish, and so we try and decrease that. So using if we get ecological minded people, so that would be a psychographic, how people think about saving the planet or saving the fish or anti-pollution stance, however you want to phrase it, but trying to capture that psychographic and how do you find them? How do you find them? How do you contact them? How can you pick out which ones to send an advertisement to? Okay, that's a problem with targeting for advertising also, is you might say, we want people that think like X, but if you can't advertise in a certain place where you can find them, how do you know how to do that? So you want to pick the right locations, the right people that are going to respond to that. And if you're making the straws, what kind of restaurant is going to be buying the eco straws and who's going to be using them, and what parts of town? What part of we talked about the different districts. What districts would you tackle? Would you target for eco straws? What district do you think has more psychographics of caring about if they have eco straws or not? Any ideas?
I think in Hon Kiem and Westlake.
Hon Kiem and where?
Westlake, Poltai.
Westlake kind of area? Westlake. Okay. And okay. And see, what's the area over by Ocean City or in Ocean City over there? What's that called?
Zalam, Mayo. Zalam.
Yeah, that's hardly Hanoi. It's so far away, but that might be an area too where people are. I think there's an eco named place, area over there and things. But that might be another target area for the product. It's just not as densely populated. But we target those for finding the right psychographic, right? What determines the right psychographic? Okay. Wealth, education, what else? Things like those two things might determine the right psychographic. What else might? Anything else that might determine it?
Occupations.
Occupation, okay. So trying to target people who think that way, you can look for different predictors, and and then try and test them with some surveys and research, or see if there's secondary data that predicts those a lot of times there's secondary data about psychographics to say who fits into different categories, and so you can look at that, and that's one way to do that. So psychographics is another final way to classify people, looking at their lifestyle, looking at how they think, their social class, or just their personality. But you have to try and find correlates with that in order to target them, like the district where they live in, and things of that nature. You can target them on the internet by social sites they go to, by different types of films they watch. If they watch, I don't know, do you watch any streaming video? You're too busy studying, right? But if you watch Netflix, we can target people by what Netflix they watch. We can target people by, what YouTubes they watch, what, TikToks they watch. You're targeted by all of those things, okay? They record everything you watch, and so they know what kind of person, they classify you into the category of what kind of person they think you are. And if I go to them as an advertiser and say, I want to target these kind of people, they say, fine, we can do that, and they'll send the ad to all those kind of people. So we can go to TikTok or these others and get them to exactly target people who look at environmental things or watch some videos that seem to indicate that, and we'll target them. Did that make sense, too? Yeah. Okay, it's 3:15. Do you want a coffee break?
Yes, please.
Okay. Am I boring you?